In the summer of 1942, one city stood between Nazi Germany and victory in the east. It was not the largest city, it was not the most important on the map, but it carried a name that Adolf Hitler could not ignore. What followed was not simply a battle, but a descent into destruction where hunger, cold, and ideology killed as surely as bullets. This is the story of how an army was trapped, a city was annihilated, and the course of the Second World War was changed forever. This is Stalingrad. On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. Nearly 1 million German and Axis troops surged eastward into the Soviet Union. In the opening months, the Wehrmacht appeared unstoppable, capturing vast territories and destroying Soviet formations in enormous encirclements. Army groups center advanced to the outskirts of Moscow itself, but Germany had misjudged the scale of the campaign. Supply lines stretched beyond their limits, fuel shortages grew severe, and Soviet resistance hardened. As winter arrived, German forces froze in place, unprepared for the brutal conditions. Moscow survived, and the war in the east did not end. When spring returned in 1942, Hitler sought a decisive solution. Germany was running out of oil, and without fuel the war could not be sustained. The answer, in Hitler's mind, lay in the Caucasus oil fields around Baku. Capturing them would both supply Germany and cripple the Soviet war machine. This new offensive was codenamed Case Blue. Army Group South was tasked with this mission. Its northern flank would be secured along the Don River, while its southern forces advanced into the Caucasus. Standing on the northern axis was the German 6th Army, a formation with a fearsome reputation. Commanded initially by Field Marshal Walter von Reich, it had played a major role in early victories of the war and had also been deeply involved in the ideological crimes of the Nazi regime in the East. In January 1942, Reich died following a heart attack and a fatal aircraft crash. His successor was General Friedrich Paulus, a methodical staff officer rather than a battlefield commander. Paulus lacked the aggressive flair of his peers, but he understood logistics and the limits of his men. He reversed some of Reich's most brutal policies, though the 6th Army continued to support extermination operations behind the lines. Before the German summer offensive could begin, the Red Army struck first. In May 1942, Soviet forces attacked near Kharkov. After days of intense fighting, Paulus and neighboring German units executed a massive encirclement. Over 250,000 Soviet troops were killed, captured, or missing. It was a devastating defeat for the Red Army and cleared the way for Case Blue. Hitler now turned south in earnest. His objectives were oil, grain, and strategic dominance. At first, the city of Stalingrad was not a primary target. Its factories and transport links were to be disrupted, not necessarily captured. But as planning progressed, the symbolic value of taking the city that bore Stalin's name began to consume Hitler's attention. German commanders raised serious concerns. The front stretched for more than 1,000 miles. Flanks would be held by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops of questionable strength. The supply system was already strained, yet Hitler pressed forward, placing great faith in the Luftwaffe to provide air support. And logistical relief, Case Blue began in late June 1942. German armored formations advanced rapidly, pushing Soviet forces into retreat. At times, German units moved faster than their supply columns could follow. Fuel shortages became chronic, forcing pauses in the advance. Meanwhile, Hitler increasingly interfered in operational decisions, clashing with his generals. By mid-July, Paulus was ordered to advance towards Stalingrad. Early clashes revealed that Soviet resistance was stiffening. Counterattacks slowed the 6th Army and exposed its flanks. Despite this, Hitler doubled down. Army Group South was split into Group A drove toward the Caucasus. Group B, including the 6th Army, was ordered to take Stalingrad. In the Soviet High Command, Marshal Georgy Zhukov and others recognized the danger. As German forces closed in, Stalin issued Order Number 227. Retreat was forbidden. Not one step back. Blocking units were established to shoot deserters. Civilians were trapped inside the city to support the defense. The battle would be fought at any cost. On August 23rd, the Luftwaffe unleashed a massive bombing campaign against Stalingrad. Incendiaries and high-explosive bombs turned the city into a sea of fire. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed. Yet the destruction created ruins that favored the defenders. Rubble-blocked tanks, snipers, and small assault groups could hide and strike at close range. When German troops entered the city, they encountered a nightmare. Fighting evolved into savage, building-by-building combat. The struggle became known as Rat and Creek, a war of rats, control of factories, stairwells, and even individual rooms changed hands repeatedly. Casualties soared. Despite heavy losses, German forces pushed Soviet defenders into a narrow strip along the Volga River. At times, the Germans could see Soviet reinforcements crossing the river under fire. The life expectancy of a Red Army soldier inside the city was often measured in hours, yet they held. By September, the German advance stalled. Supplies were running low. Tanks and artillery wore out. The Luftwaffe was exhausted. To reinforce the battle, Hitler stripped German units from the flanks and replaced them with Axis allies. This decision would prove fatal. In November 1942, the Red Army finally unleashed the counterstroke that would decide the fate of Stalingrad. After months of brutal defensive fighting inside the city, Soviet commanders had deliberately avoided committing their strongest forces into the ruins. Instead, Marshal Georgy Zhukov and the Stavka concentrated men, tanks, artillery, and aircraft far from German observation, aiming not at the city itself, but at the overstretched flanks guarding it. Those flanks were held not by German divisions, but by Romania's Third Army to the north and Fourth Army to the south. These units were poorly equipped to face modern armored warfare. Many lacked effective anti-tank weapons, had limited artillery support, and were spread thin across wide sectors of open steppe. German commanders were well aware of this vulnerability, but repeated warnings to Hitler were dismissed. At dawn on November 19th, Soviet artillery erupted along the northern flank. For more than an hour, thousands of guns and rocket launchers saturated Romanian positions with the crushing bombardment. When the fire lifted, waves of Soviet infantry and hundreds of T-34 tanks surged forward through the smoke. Despite brave resistance, Romanian defenses collapsed under the sheer weight of the assault. Within hours, entire sectors of the front had disintegrated. The following day, November 20th, the Soviets struck again, this time against the southern flank. Once more, Axis defenses were shattered by overwhelming firepower and armor. Soviet mobile formations drove deep into the rear areas, bypassing strong points and racing westward toward key road and rail junctions. German armored units that might have counterattacked were either exhausted from fighting inside Stalingrad or immobilized by fuel shortages. Confusion reigned at headquarters as reports of breakthroughs multiplied within for days. Soviet spearheads from north and south met near the town of Kalik. On the Don River, the encirclement was complete. Inside the ring were the German 6th Army, elements of the 4th Panzer Army, and various Axis units. Nearly 300,000 men were now trapped in what would become known as the Stalingrad pocket, cut off from all land routes and surrounded by a rapidly strengthening Red Army. General Friedrich Paulus immediately understood the danger. In the first days after the encirclement, Soviet forces were still consolidating their positions. A rapid breakout to the west, though costly, was still possible. Paulus requested permission to abandon Stalingrad and fight his way out before the ring tightened. Hitler refused. To Hitler, retreat was unthinkable. He believed that German soldiers, once ordered to hold ground, could not be dislodged. He also feared the political and symbolic consequences of abandoning the city that bore Stalin's name Instead, he ordered the Sixth Army to remain where it was and await relief from outside forces. To sustain this decision, Hitler placed his faith in the Luftwaffe. Hermann Goering assured him that German air power could supply the encircled army by air. Just as it had done in smaller encirclements earlier in the war, Goering promised that food, fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies would be flown daily until a relief operation broke through. In reality, the promise was an illusion. The distances were vast, the weather was deteriorating, and the number of transport aircraft was far too small. The Sixth Army required hundreds of tons of supplies every day simply to survive. The Luftwaffe could deliver only a fraction of that amount, even under ideal conditions. As winter closed in and Soviet air defenses strengthened, the airlift was doomed to fail. Yet the order stood. The Sixth Army was to hold Stalingrad, whatever the cost. That cost was measured first in hunger. As the encirclement tightened and the airlift faltered, daily rations were cut again and again. Bread was reduced to a few hundred grams. Then less. Meat disappeared entirely. Horses were slaughtered, their frozen flesh eaten raw or barely cooked. When even that ran out, soldiers scavenged among the dead, stripping corpses for scraps of food or gnawing on leather belts and boots softened in water. It was paid in cold. Temperatures plunged far below freezing, and many German soldiers lacked proper winter clothing. Fires were forbidden in exposed positions for fear of Soviet artillery and air attack. Men huddled together in cellars and trenches, sharing body heat, while frostbite claimed fingers, toes, and limbs. Those too weak to move often froze to death where they lay. The cost was also disease. Typhus, dysentery, and gangrene spread rapidly in the overcrowded ruins. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Surgeons operated without anesthetic. Wounds that would once have been survivable became death sentences. Hospitals were nothing more than dark basements filled with the groans of the dying. It was paid in. Morale, discipline, once rigid, began to crumble. Officers lost control over starving men driven by desperation. Fights broke out over food. Theft became common. Some soldiers simply lay down and refused to rise again. Others took their own lives rather than face slow death or capture. Civilians and prisoners paid the price as well. Any remaining inhabitants of the city were stripped of food and shelter. Soviet prisoners of war inside the pocket were left to die in the open. Even children were exploited, sent to fetch water from the Volga under sniper fire, a task that often ended in death. The cost was paid in silence and abandonment. As airfields fell and transport aircraft failed to land, hope vanished. Each day without planes meant more men lost. Letters were no longer written. Units stopped reporting. The Sixth Army was being erased piece by piece, and finally, the cost was paid in total destruction. Of the hundreds of thousands sent to Stalingrad, the vast majority would never leave. They would die of hunger, cold, wounds, or exhaustion, or vanish into captivity from which almost none would return. This was the price of holding Stalingrad, not victory, not honor, only annihilation. The airlift failed, only a fraction of the required. Supplies reached the pocket, aircraft were lost to weather, anti-aircraft fire. And mechanical failure, hunger and disease spread, soldiers froze, starved, and fought on amid ruins. In December, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launched a relief attempt from the south. His forces came close, but could not break through. Without a breakout from inside the pocket, Hitler forbade Paulus from attempting it. The opportunity passed. As winter deepened, the situation became hopeless. Daily rations fell to almost nothing. Discipline collapsed. The wounded were left untreated. On January 30th, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to Field Marshal, a clear signal that he was expected to die rather than surrender. Paulus refused suicide in the final days of January 1943. The remnants of the German Sixth Army were collapsing under relentless Soviet pressure. The encircled pocket had been split in two, communications were breaking down, and organized command was barely functioning. Many units no longer existed as coherent formations. What remained were scattered groups of starving, frostbitten men clinging to cellars, trenches, and shattered buildings. On January 30th, Adolf Hitler promoted Friedrich Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. The message was unmistakable. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive. The expectation was that Paulus would die fighting or take his own life. Paulus rejected both options. He had no intention of sacrificing himself to preserve Hitler's pride, nor could he justify the continued destruction of his army. On the morning of January 31st, Soviet forces advanced into the southern sector of the pocket, pushing steadily toward Paulus' headquarters, which was located in the basement of a ruined department store in central Stalingrad. Surrounded, exhausted, and with no realistic means of resistance left, Paulus agreed to surrender the forces under his immediate command. He ordered a ceasefire in the southern pocket, though he did not formally command the remaining northern group. 2 days later, on February 2nd, 1943, the last organized German resistance ceased. The final units laid down their weapons amid snow, rubble, and the bodies of the dead. The battle that had raged for more than 5 months was finally over. Of the more than 260,000 German and Axis troops originally trapped inside the Stalingrad pocket, only about 91,000 were taken prisoner. They were weak, malnourished, and often barely able to walk. For many, captivity proved almost as lethal as the battle itself. Disease, exposure, and exhaustion claimed tens of thousands. Fewer than 6,000 of those captured would ever return to Germany. The Battle of Stalingrad had ended in total disaster for Nazi Germany. An entire field army had been destroyed. The Luftwaffe had been broken as a strategic force in the east. The myth of German invincibility, carefully cultivated since the early victories of the war, lay in ruins alongside the city itself. From that moment on, the strategic initiative passed permanently to the Soviet Union. The Red Army would continue to grow in strength, pushing westward through Ukraine, Eastern Europe, and eventually into the heart of Germany itself. Stalingrad was not merely a defeat, it was a psychological, military, and ideological turning point. It was the moment the war in the East became unwinnable for Hitler.